Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 8 of our coverage, the 2017 Grand Prix in Geneva. We have this round and the next one, and we will have a champion in the third leg of the Grand Prix series. Our competitors today both in the running still for the title. White's going to be played by Nepomniachtchi, and Black's going to be played by Levon Aronian. So we'll go ahead and get started. Pawn to c4. A knight to f6, a knight to c3, and this is the English opening and getting into the 4 knights game that we saw earlier in the tournament, which before this tournament we rarely see this opening, and then in this tournament we've already covered 2 of the games so far where we've seen this. Pawn to g3, getting ready to fianchetto on the king side of the board, very similar to opening we saw before. Pawn d5, after the capture, then bishop to g2. The previous game we looked at, we saw the bishop coming down here to c5, not the main line. In this particular game that you're looking at, Levon Aronian decided to go more of the main line, and that is knight to b6. Castle on the king side for white, and then bishop to e7, getting ready to castle for black on the king side as well. White plays pawn to a3. Could have, if you want to, stretch a little bit further with pawn to a4, but decides to go ahead and keep things a little closer to home with pawn to a3. Pawn to a5, extending a little bit on the queen side for black, and then pawn to d3. So you can see that White's plan is not to push up too far in this early position. Castle on the king side, and then bishop to e3. There's not a ton of options that White's giving himself. He's kind of blocked off a little bit as far as where he can move. Pawn on b2 is kind of stopping the bishop from going anywhere to this side of the board. The queen could definitely come to c2 if he wanted to. Could play just bishop to d2, but decides to go and play bishop to e3, which is going to stop him from pushing forward with his e-pawn for just a while. So bishop to e3, and then bishop to e6, both sides just getting their pieces involved into the game. Rook over here to c1, controlling the semi-open file, and then pawn to a4. So pushing a little bit on the queen side, more than I would particularly like from Black's point of view, because you could easily just have the bishop take on b6. That knight is now defending this pawn as well as this rook, but you could have the bishop take on b6, and then after the pawn recaptures, Black has double pawns on the b file. Don't necessarily like that from Black. If it's in the center of the board and you have another pawn next to it, you can actually push and have good control. But on the b file, you just don't see as a good success, especially getting into the endgame with a double pawn. But then from here, you could just see pawn to e3, or even better for White, I think, is just taking here on a4. The rook is now attacking it, but the queen here on d1 is protecting it. So it seems like he's going to be giving up material, and has a double pawn structure here. So not my favorite place of this pawn here to a4, but Jan decides to go ahead and not take here on b6, but instead play knight to d2. So very, very obvious that he wants to just keep his pieces back, build up a particular position that maybe he's been looking at for a long time, and then continue from there. This does open up the door for the light square bishop to attack if he wants to. As soon as Levon Aronian saw this, he decided to play pawn to f5. So he kind of saw an opportunity to push a little bit, have a strong attack. He could have easily played knight to d5, say, I don't want the bishop now taking on b6. So I would consider this playing it safe, knight here to d5, but decided to be a little bit more aggressive and play pawn to f5, weakening the king side of the board, but really starting to attack his opponent, saying that he can maybe cramp the position from White. Now, and only now, White decides to go ahead and take. Bishop takes on b6. We see the pawn recapture. Now the knight takes here on a4, and then bishop to g5. So White has a cramped position, and so you kind of see what both sides are looking to do. Now these pawn structure on the b file is even worse than before because there's no pawns on either side of it. So although White is up material just on the pawn side, he's up even a little bit more because these pawns just don't do as well. It's going to be even easier for White to really attack these, especially if this knight moves, then that pawn's going to be hanging to this bishop right here. White's really trying to get out of this cramped position. Black's trying to use his aggressive placement right here. Double bishops on board. Also has kind of the central pawns in the center, and he could easily get both of his rooks and his queen involved into the game. His knight over on the A file is not doing a whole lot right now. His knight on the D2 square is not very centrally involved, and his rook here on F1 is going to take a while before it can get involved. So Levon Aronian really needs to keep up the pressure. As soon as White can start to open up the game, trade down some material, he's going to have a better in-game than Levon Aronian is. So White plays knight to C3, doesn't want to have it on the A file, wants to get it back involved into the game. The pawn here to E4, so pushing that strong attack that Levon Aronian has, seeing if he can have his opponent crack. Rook to B1, wants to get it out of the way of the pin. The bishop here on G5 is pinning down this knight, so he wants to be able to move this knight freely, defend this square, or attack it here on E4. Can't really do that if he has his rook here on C1. So although it is controlling this open C file, wants to make sure that it is safe from that pin. So moves it back here to B1, and then knight to E5. Had a few options here. Could have maybe played knight to D4, but this is going to be a lot worse. So it's always important to look at where you're going to go and what your opponent can do, because after, let's say, knight to D4, which is a huge mistake, White could play pawn to E3, and it gets extremely tricky now that the knight's going to have to move. Let's say he comes back here to C6. Now the pawn takes on E4, and it's pretty bad. White's starting to open up the game. He has both the knight and the bishop defending the square here on E4. Black's going to go down another pawn in material, and he's also allowing White to open up the game state and not be as cramped anymore. If the knight doesn't come back to C6, let's say he comes to F3, which is somewhat tricky, but he could try it for funsies sake. Knight takes on F3, could see an exchange. Queen takes here on F3. Maybe the queen takes on D3, just trying to gobble up some material, but queen takes on B7. White's up a huge advantage right here. There's no real way for Black to attack this. White should have a pretty easy game from here. So decides to go ahead and play knight to E5 instead, which is probably the better move. Knight over here to B3, getting ready to position it to the center of the board, more than likely. Knight to D4 at some point. And then knight over here to G4. Black knows that the king side of the board is his best option to start to attack his opponent. Queen to C2, finalizing the development of White's side of the board. Hasn't really moved his queen yet. So queen to C2, and then bishop down here to E3. And first you may look at it and say, well, you didn't even capture material on E3. That's a weird move. Well, the pawn's not going to take, because then knight takes on E3. Traded that bishop for the pawn, but now he's attacking both the queen on C2 and the rook here on F1. And the board state's not really open right now, so this is a pretty good position from Black. White's not going to be taking that right now. Decides to go ahead and take with the pawn on E4. Says, we'll make this trade if you want to a little bit later, but let me open up the board state where if you actually do bring your knight down, I can get my queen into a better position. So that's kind of what he's going with. Pawn takes on E4. Then the queen comes down here to G5, and I think he has a missed opportunity here. Levon Aronian had knight takes on F2, which almost seems like that's what he was going for with bishop down here to E3. It couldn't have just been to bait his opponent to try to take it, because I don't think White's going to be doing that most of the time, especially at highest level play. So there has to be some sort of plan B, and I think knight to F2 is that plan. If the rook were to take here on F2, I think that's fine. The bishop is pinning down this rook. It's not really going anywhere. Pawn could take on E4. That's fine. Then you could see maybe the rook come over here to F1. This rook's not going anywhere because it's pinned down. Queen to C7, getting it more involved into the game. If at any time this king were to move, let's say king H1, then the bishop could just take here on F2. It's a really tricky spot for White. He has to tie up so much of his major material, or else he's going to end up losing material. So I think the knight taking on F2 was kind of what Black should have been going for the entire time, but instead decided to play queen down here to G5. White decides to go ahead and now take with the pawn on e3. Said, hey, if you want to go ahead and take the knight on e3, attack both the rook and the queen, that's fine. We're going to have a pretty active position now that we've opened up the board state a little bit more. So it is a risk for white because he's going to be losing one of his major pieces, more than likely the rook here on f1. But black decides to not even go with that option, instead taking with his queen. Queen down here to e3 check, king over here to h1, safety for now. Queen back to h6, pawn to h3, just trying to avoid checkmate. Queen down here to h2 would be checkmate. Knight to e3, so we do have the fork in place right now. Queen to d2, pawn to f4, so starting to put pressure on his opponent. And then queen, or the pawn takes on f4 first. Knight takes down here on f1. Rook takes over here on f1. So we start to see a lot of exchanges on boards, and this is exactly what white wants to happen on the board. He is up in material. If he can just trade down towards the endgame, he's going to have a much better endgame. So it's an interesting approach from Levon Aronian. He had a very strong attack, and now he's started to lose a lot of his material. No longer has any pawns, so it's going to be tough for him to get past all of these 4 pawns on the king side of the board. He really needs to get his other rook involved, have a really strong attack. There's just so much material that white has to kind of stop that. So white should have kind of a easy in-game, in my opinion. But you never know at some of this high-level play. Bishop takes here on b3, so does want to get some of that material back. Is kind of waiting for black to go ahead and take this. But first wanted to go ahead and exchange some of the pieces on the king side of the board for some reason. Pawn to e5, so white does have a pass pawn. Anytime you have a pass pawn, rule number 1 is push that forward as fast as possible. Just put so much pressure on your opponent. Black is now going to be forced to use his rooks, potentially his queen, to stop that attack instead of really putting pressure on his opponent. Then white's going to have an easier in-game, not having to worry about any pressure from black. Rook a8 to e8. Could have also played his f rook to e8. Both of those are going to be tough for him, but decides to go and bring his a rook over since he wasn't doing anything with it. Knight to e4. Then the king comes up here to h8, king h2, bishop back here to g8. I don't really like this from black. It kind of waves the white flag to me. Bishop on g8 is about as defensive as you can get in a spot in the game where he does not need to be defensive. There's just not a lot of great options for black. Could have tried bishop up here to e6 to stop some of the attack. You know, it stops pawn to f5 because he has both the bishop and the rook. The pawn can't push forward at any time. So there's that, but decided to go and play bishop to g8, pawn e3, so just starting to push the pawn structure a little bit. Rook to e6, so stopping the pawn pushing forward, but this pawn is also a nice little outpost for the knight. Knight comes up here to d6, threatening the pawn on b7. No real way to hold on to that unless he wants to bring his rook over here to b8, which is kind of a mess for black as well. Queen to h4 is going to try an attack on the king side of the board. He just doesn't have much material to go along with that queen. Queen to d4, just more centralizing the white queen. Rook here to g6, so starting an attack, just doesn't have too much material. Rook to f3, queen down here to e1. Pawn to f5, just saying, yeah, your queen's all alone. I'm going to start to attack your rook. Rook down here, g5, pawn h4, rook here, h5, rook to g3, stopping any sort of queen and rook combination here. Bishop down here, e6, really just looking for something to open up the door. So if the pawn were to take, now the rook can get involved into the game. But decides to go ahead and just take, says it doesn't really matter. I don't see a way for you to actually come down, have a perpetual check or anything. Levon Aronian also could not find a continuation where he did not lose, and so decided in this position to go ahead and resign. So congratulations, great game for whites. Nepomniachtchi still has a chance to win the tournament. He's half a point off of the lead right now. So going into the last round, this was very important for him. So congratulations. Hopefully you guys enjoyed round 8. Been a great tournament so far. And I will see you guys tomorrow for round number 9.